without further ado, I'm going to pass you off to Mike Sotero, who is going to introduce himself as well as this amazing team in front of you today.
Well, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon. As Christina said, my name is Mike Sotero. I'm an elementary principal in Hudson Valley, New York, and I do a lot of MTSS work for our district. Along with us today, we'll just go right down the line. We'll start next. I'll pass it off to Dr. Steve Rapplier.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. Dr. Steve Rapplier. I'm an MTSS coach for schools in New York. I'm part of a statewide MTSS initiative, and I'm happy to be here. And I'll pass it over to Kelly White.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelly White. I'm the Deputy Superintendent in the Ellenville Central School District, also in the Hudson Valley, New York area. We are new partners with Branching Minds this school year, and in my role, I support our student support staff and building administration in shifting from the RTI model to MTSS. And I will turn it over to Michael Camargo.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mike Camargo. I'm a behavior analyst and a licensed mental health counselor in the Ellenville Central School District. I work mainly with the pre-K through 6 grades. And I'm going to pass it on to Dan Kenny.
Hi, I'm Dan Kenny. I'm a school psychologist down in Long Island now. Previously, I've been working with Mike Sotero in his school. I've been a big part of rolling out the MTSS process there in that district, and that rolling out is mostly what I'm here to talk about.
And finally, we have the person who put this all together, Victoria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Sotero. I work for Ulster BOCES, which if you're not a New York person, it's a cooperative service group, and we're basically by county for New York State. So I'm for Ulster County, and I put together great PDs, but my specialty is in data. It is my passion. When I say that, I usually get an eye roll or like a snore emoji, but I think I'm in the right spot being here with y'all today. So thank you for coming to this session. I'm really, really excited to talk to you about different ways that we can like rock and roll with data viz. But before we get into that, Mike, can you, because this is going to come up and I'm sure at some point in our session, someone's going to be like, why is this here? Can you tell everyone why there are umbrellas across this slide deck?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. So it's starting to snow here in New York. It's an El Nino season. It might be raining somewhere else. But to jump right from weather, those 3 umbrellas are a metaphor. So if you work MTSS, you are probably very familiar with a triangle or, more recently, an umbrella. So we're going to talk in a moment and ask you all, where are you at in your MTSS process? And we're actually going to poll you. And those 3 metaphors with the umbrellas are this. If your umbrella looks like it's just the spokes with no coverage, like that umbrella all the way to the right, that's okay. You are at a building stage to really feel out your systems and fill them in. Your umbrella could look like the umbrella in the middle and say, hey, we feel like we have a lockdown on universal screeners or on end of the year, beginning of the year assessments, but we're not quite there yet. Or you could be like, we are an MTSS rock star. I don't know why you're up there talking with your Christmas sweater on or holiday sweater on. I know more than you. And my umbrella is almost fully covered as the umbrella all the way on the left. So just keep those in mind that you could be anywhere you want in this process. It's never final. You're always going to need an umbrella, but it's not always going to need to cover everything. So here we go. So before we start talking, we're going to ask you, where are you at in this process? And we had our Dan Kenny create this poll, and I'm going to kick it out to y'all and just take about a minute or two to fill it out. Where are you at in the process? Hopefully this tech works, and what you see there is what is your MTSS? What is MTSS again? I don't even know what it is. or we've been using something else for our IST or SST strategy, or hey, we're just getting started, or it could be we're getting there, we're regular benchmarks and meetings, or we're masters of MTSS and we are just simply looking for tips. So we'll give you another minute or two. And Christina, can we see that poll somewhere on this screen?
Yep. If you go in and open that poll box up on your screen, you should be able to see it. I can give you a little rundown too if that's easier. It looks like things have slowed down.
Okay.
So it looks at about 54% have regular benchmarking and meetings. So I'm going to give a little confetti explosion for that. And then our second highest group at 33% is we're just getting started. So I think they're all probably in a great place to hear from you. And there are no votes for what is MTSS again. So either people are just pretending to know. They're like, wait, I don't want them to know I don't know anything. Or they're here ready to learn a little bit more from you.
I think it's because we're on day 2 of the conference, and maybe if we did that yesterday morning, we might have a few more. But
yeah, that's a really good point. So that's good. I'll pass that back to our team. Like, people know what MTSS is. We're good. The summit was a success.
All right. So this is going to be like a roundtable. We're going to throw out questions. Some of our folks here on the panel will take them, but feel free at any time that you want to join in on the chat, and you might be someone who contributes the most to one question. So the first thing when people think about MTSS really and then adding data visualization is just this. What are the benefits of using data visualizations in the context of MTSS? And then in addition to what are the benefits, well, how does it help us make these decisions? So can we have, if Dan Kenny can hear us, jump right in. Otherwise, we can have Steve or Vic go right to
it. Yeah, sure. I think the key thing about data visualization is that it communicates a lot of information very quickly, right? And when it's done well, someone without a lot of background is going to be able to look at it and say, oh, I understand what's going on here. Really, as a psychologist, graphs and charts are a big tool that I use every day because I'm trying to communicate a lot of information at once for stuff that people don't necessarily have a lot of background knowledge on. So taking that same concept of, here's where a kid is at, here's where this is the amount of growth they've had, and here's what our targets look like, can be really hard to explain without using visualizations. And when everyone's on the same page and everyone has an idea of what to expect and where students performing and how much growth they've had, we're able to make a lot better decisions.
Thank you, Dan, for that. We're going to move on, I think, right now to question 2. So when we talk about how effective it can be, people are often, depending on the stage that they're at, going to ask to say, well, can we see some examples for how this data visualization can be successful? And what do those look like? Dr. Rapplier, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I just want to, as I start talking about this, I want to acknowledge the way that Dan expressed the utility of data visualizations as part of our shared understanding process. We who are experts in particular fields can look at data like we're reading tea leaves to other people. That's what it appears to be. If we can take that knowledge and then simplify it in such a way that we share knowledge about the data, about what's behind the data, then we can engage thought partners from a wider range, and that allows us to make better decisions at every point. When you look at something simple, as like a graph, that's not necessarily the full capacity that you could approach when you talk about a visualization. Think about something more like a graph that's embedded in an infographic where you have some motion on the page visually. So you're leading information from one point to another. Think about ways in which you've seen even animations used, and there's some applications that you can use to animate data. In terms of where we've seen them successfully used, one of the ways in which we communicate process really effectively is a one-page infographic. If you can take a complex process and distill it down to items that fit onto one page, folks are much more likely to be able to build a reasonable understanding of that. So I've seen that used really well as we work with groups who need to process information within a system, and to say, this group does this portion first, this information comes from here, then you do that next. I almost wish I hadn't thought about it before this moment, but it'd be really neat to pull up an infographic and see what that looks like. Just this morning, I was working with a middle school team who was working on putting together a package of information to share around PBIS. And they had pulled up a one-page version of an explanation of PBIS for parents that was just wonderfully developed. So that as a parent, you could take this item, look at it, and really have a pretty good beginning understanding of all the things that are happening for your child's school. I don't know if anybody else has anything they'd like to throw in for an example of a data visualization strategy.
I definitely do. I'm thinking like we have the questions posed here, and obviously we're with Branching Minds, and they're a data visualization platform, and they offer, a great look at how a student or a cohort or a group thereof that's tagged together is doing. But for those in this session, MTSS is one facet inside your district, right? Or inside your BOCES or your group. So it being one facet, you don't want it to appear like just another initiative. You want it to appear like something that is actually moving forward, encompassing many initiatives, or just the way that we do things. So I know that when we're thinking about that, and maybe the MTSS is new, or maybe it's old, so it either is well branded, about to be branded, or kind of needs a reboot, the way that you communicate that information visually to your stakeholders is very important. So when Steve is saying, an infographic and aiming for that like single data point, that's great too. But, thinking about colors, like you might be very well branded in your district with your district's colors. Like I know Ellenville, we have two folks on the call here, they're blue and gold. Like you just know, like right away that they're their colors. I mean, geez Louise, you can see Kelly's their cabinets are that blue. It is that blue, it's that hex code. But when you do that, when you think about your branding, and then you think about, I have to communicate X and such about MTSS, whether it's a piece of the process or it's an outcome, right? So it's one of the two things typically. How are you going to communicate that in a regular, predictable fashion? And I think after pandemic, I really urge people to think about predictable scenarios and predictable ways in which people come to information, whether it's data about students or something new to do. The easier and cleaner that you keep that communication down to a single data point, or like even if it's an icon like the umbrella, if the umbrella is there, I know it's going to be information about our MTSS work. So just thinking about that, I think, is helpful. I would also, even bigger picture than that, think about how MTSS fits into the story of your school, and think about how the data can like fit into that story. And even if every kid is not doing great in your district, which is not the case, everyone's doing what they're doing right, and everyone's growing. How can you tell the story of process, right? So it's built on like hope, it's built on moving into the future, it's built on best practice. If you hand people like a long, 1,000-word email, it's not going to communicate it as well as like a great infographic or a one-pager like Steve's mentioning.
Right. I wanted to point out the power of the branded graphics, because what people do, what the brand package as a part of how you present information. If you, as Victoria pointed out, we have brand identities as organizations, as schools, as educational agencies, and using that to help people understand who it's coming from, who it's representing, and also to a certain extent give an attractive visual to look at that people recognize as being part of the organization helps you not necessarily to communicate the information, but to communicate the importance of the information. There's lots of ways you can do things on a whiteboard, on a piece of paper, or on or in an email. But to take the time to produce something that is high quality, people recognize that. People have become much more graphically sophisticated. People are used to living in a world of graphic vernacular. So if you don't attend to that, you're losing people's attention. Just one last example just occurred to me of an example of a visualization strategy that improved some MTSS implementation. One of the areas that I see many districts struggling with in my work this year is around attendance. It is not the rare district that is trying to improve attendance. And what one district that I'm working with did was produced a heat map of attendance problems in the community. So using that heat map, you can very vividly see the geographic relationship between where in a community a student lives and the likelihood of their attendance being problematic. It's an incredibly powerful version of a set of data that they had already, names and addresses, but presented in a very different way that tells a very specific story.
I think that's a great to highlight that. If you're doing a lot of reading and education these days, the focus not only is on the whole child, especially coming out of COVID, but then even digging into what that means and getting them there to school is kind of the first part of our job. So if we move in to a next question, which is kind of a branch off now of that, we're the professionals here, not just us talking, but all of you, all 72 of you in this session. So how can we use this data visualization to create PD, to train our staff, so that we build their capacities to use this information? And I think Kelly White probably has some ideas for this one.
Hello again. So in terms of professional development, not all educators and certainly, not all parents have been trained on how to analyze data. So it's really important when we speak about professional development and even opportunities for parents to learn how to understand how to view their child's data. It's important that we provide that instruction. We're lucky that we have a great relationship with our BOCES here in New York, and we rely on them a lot for not only providing training to our administrators, but also our teachers. And we found it really effective when our teachers can also take what they learned and introduce it to students, to get students used to looking at data and becoming experts of their own learning and in their own journeys. In terms of using data to improve their understanding and use of MTSS, one thing that we as a district here, as we're trying to get teachers not only to use their data, but how to then take that data and look at the trends and the patterns that we're finding in the data, and how to use those visualizations for progress monitoring and intervention planning. I don't know if there's anything else you want to expand on with that, Victoria, from what you're seeing here in Ellenville.
Yeah, I'm thinking, there's a huge need to have not just the markers and the next. So I'm getting a little bit very super granular compared to what I was just talking about. But there's definitely a need for looking at the growth and then like the expected growth. So like every single like marker that you'd be using or assessment that you'd be looking at has expected growth over time. And I think that needs to be integrated a lot more into the visualization process. So it's not a matter of like, oh, you got a 2 in the first quarter and then you get a 2 in the second quarter. It's like, well, what are the actual skill expectations and how are you growing and trending towards them? So I think we've been looking at marking more than just the student achievement, but student growth and then expected growth. So that's like a different way to visualize and think about data altogether.
You know, the big talk in education over the past few decades has moved to PLC and that collaboration, whether it's vertically or horizontally among grade levels or up through subjects. But adding this data piece really can enhance groups' understanding. So if in the chat there's this particular areas where you think to yourself, hey, in our work, you know, I really wish we had data and we could visualize it on whatever it is. You know, Steve mentioned attendance. Obviously, there's reading scores, math scores. But if you have any of those ideas, you know, certainly throw that in there through our running conversation. And speaking of that, on our second branch off of that question is, are there any examples of innovative or even novel techniques or tools that really could be up and coming in the field of education or MTSS? Who has some ideas for those on our group?
I think the idea of making visualizations more interactive is really important. So just like I said about the growth line, like could you tap the growth line and do something with it? If it was an infographic sent to parents, could it be inclusive of a QR code or a link to like a video of the superintendent talking about something? Is there like another dimension that you can add to like elicit a response? Because anything that we're talking about, whether you're giving it to staff or staff is logging on to Branching Minds, I mean, of course they make plans, but let's just say they're just logging on, or, you know, you give, you know, a 90-page spreadsheet and you expect change, or whatever the situation is that you have going on with handing data to people. No matter how good it is, we all live very busy lives and you don't actually know how it's landing on your users. So I think like providing that like feedback loop, something that people can respond to, is important.
So Victoria, thank you for that. We see our chat blowing up here with folks either saying, hey, I'm tracking this, or we found a way to progress monitor that. And then other folks saying, what about this area? Does anyone have any of those ideas? So keep that populating that in the chat. We'll have a few other questions out there, and we're going to save this information. And there'll be a point where we're going to share some of our contact information in the chat, and you can reach out to us individually because some of us do this work. And then we can help you. I see some people there saying, hey, do you have examples of some of these templates that we could use? And certainly that can be provided by many of us. Some will actually be here in our presentation. But if it's not covered in what we're talking about, we're going to supply our contact information, and then you can reach out to us through there. So if we move on to our third question, and then we'll integrate what we see in the chat. That question really, you know, how can educators effectively communicate data-driven insights to the different stakeholders? Because keep in mind, sometimes you're cut in the middle and you're a principal and you're trying to advocate to the people above you at district office or central office. And then you're trying to talk to parents at meetings, and then your staff trying to move instruction. Other times you're just trying to convince the Board of Ed to do something, or you're a small student-focused team and you're just trying to get that kid to stop saying what they're saying to the other student at these certain times. So what are the ways that we can communicate those insights to these different stakeholders, whether it be teachers, parents, administrators, or even students?
I mean, I'm going to jump right in here, and I see it too in the chat. Like with the idea of presenting data to community and board, it needs to be clean, it needs to be branded, and it needs to be simple, 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 simple. The best, most impactful data will have one one datum in it, one tiny little data point, and you repeat it over time. So don't have a pie chart and then a bar chart. Don't have a line graph and then a heat map. Don't do it, because our data literacy isn't there. So I will say that, like, just like right off the bat, like, make it predictable, make it look the same. And it might seem like, wow, Victoria, like, who has time to like search a hex code and like make it look all professional? But it's time well spent, because you're actually creating a field that people can then be data literate in. If you're handing folks something different or a different spreadsheet every single meeting, it'll become really confusing. And then I'll say here too, like, I'm seeing how can we data-driven insights. I'm wondering if we have any thought here about how we can communicate more of our qualitative data, like, because that is a whole world in and of itself. So like, how are we working in the field to, like, great, that's how you're doing an MTSS, that's how you achieve something. Maybe you change your attendance rate, maybe you changed some kind of achievement or increased positive behavior, but so what? How are we feeling about it? How do we communicate that with the board? How do we communicate that with our community at large? And I don't want to be too long-winded before I start seeing this in the chat and your answer on that, but I've been doing a lot of focus groups in different schools lately. And there was this one student, the effort of these kind of empathy interview style focus groups was to kind of get how things are going from an equity standpoint. And it came out from a top 10 in the cohort student that she was miserable. Like, okay, like, you are a beautiful child, you are top 10 in your class, you are taking every advanced class, you're going Ivy League, you play all the sports, you're all the things. You're miserable. Why are you miserable? She gets so anxious with writing, but nobody could see that. So then the counselor just simply changed her schedule to be more math and science. Beautiful, problem solved. But if we had never asked that child that, so let alone like communicating that, but if we hadn't asked and done that like qualitative data dive, and then we would have gotten the information. So I guess, I don't know, I'm putting that all out there to say, like, we have to be thoughtful about what we're missing in the communication, and is that purposeful, or I don't know, maybe even just prefacing it with like, hey, this isn't always the full picture. Like, just because you put up a chronic absenteeism rate, that is not the full picture. That number does not equal your students.
I think one of the questions that's not in the chat is hex code. What the heck is a hex code? What does that mean?
Anybody? Other? I can do it, but anybody other than me?
It's a universal designation for a color on a computer screen, essentially.
So like Benjamin Moore, the little number when I can't figure out what's the name of that paint. Is it Foggy Bottom or is it hex code 307?
Yeah.
Got it.
Correct. And they actually have like extensions. So you can look in on Chrome, and there'll be free extensions to find a hex code. So you can look, like, if I'm working for Ellenville, I will literally go to their website, grab the hex code. It'll give me that I think it's a 6 or 7 digit number, and then you can find it anywhere, and you can even put it in your slide deck. It's just a really simple way, like, and use the same fonts. Like, don't get wild with the fonts. Keep it real nice and clean.
Yeah, there's a reason here. While some of our attire and sweaters are the big visual, and our presentation is actually really black and white, and even our imagery with the umbrellas. So 2 things here. Misty Lambert puts in about attendance, empathy meetings. And then one more point with the branding, when a little kid sees those yellow arches, McDonald's has ingrained that in. All you need to do is see just that swoosh, and everyone knows everything that comes with it, the athletes that come with it, what it means. And there's no reason that we can't use those techniques in the field of education to move ideas. So Misty Lambert right there talks about parent contacts, home visits. And then you have Cassandra West speaking about how she presented to academic excellence using scatter plots. So just if you know, hey, when we're going to show our data, we're going to use scatter plots. So every time you sit down and you see that and you link it to something that looks like, a Jackson Pollock painting, they're going to know, like, hey, we're looking at data, and we're usually looking for us to win. Or in Misty's question, maybe there's some way that you use data to then show, hey, when kids hit this mark, when they hit this level or turn this color in their formatting, we now unleash the empathy meetings, the parent contacts, the home visits. It's keeping consistent on the way you want to get creative with that messaging. And I think if we move to question 4, it'll speak a little more to it. What are the challenges that we face when we're trying to create this work, trying to interpret it, and then how we can work through it. And I think someone on our panel has done some of this work before we throw it out to the chat about what are these actual challenges, like what makes it hard. So Dan Kenny, can you speak to that?
Yeah, again, looking at multiple pieces of data simultaneously can be really overwhelming. And when we're talking about educating kids, the clock doesn't stop, right? Where the norm is, where the expected performance is, goes up with the time, as the year goes on. So in many ways, we're trying to hit a moving target. So when you are able to share visualizations that have the expected growth rate, that have how the students been growing themselves and where they currently are in their own performance, that can be a really great mechanism for helping people wrap their heads around where a student's at. In the slide deck, I believe, I think it's slide 18, there is there's a visualization there that's pretty commonly used if you've had a student who's done any map testing. So there's various types of benchmarking assessments out there, and they all have different ways to kind of communicate the information. And this is one really good way to kind of help one wrap their head around the idea of using data visualization and making MTSS type decisions. For things like reading and math, the norms are a bit more established, and in those circumstances, you really want to use those norms. So you can see a student's growth rate over time go from what would be a well below average range and then into a low average range. And then you can kind of see where the average range would be expected to be. In software like this too, you can also often get a trajectory to see based on where they've been performing and how they've been performing with the current interventions. This is where they're likely to land next time. So having tools like that can be a really great way to help communicate and help people wrap their head around the different concepts here in MTSS.
Thank you for that, Dana. Anyone else on our panel want to jump in on that before we transition to our next question?
I mean, I just would say like the challenge is like, whoa, you're looking in your role, you might look at a certain graph or chart a lot, and then teachers might not have access, or parent might not look at it all the time. So I would definitely start every single meeting or every single moment that you're having with data another person with either isolating the columns first and being like, what is this even looking at? Pulling it apart just to see like, are we on the same page? And I think that's like a 45 seconds really well spent. I think it just anchors people in, especially with like that last visual we saw. It's really charged with color, like red, bad, right? Green, good. Like you want to make sure like everyone even knows what they're looking at. And I'm saying red, bad, green, good. And who knows, maybe the tool that we're looking at is flipped. So just making sure like we're all clear on the key, clear on what we're looking on. I think that's a huge challenge. And then especially when, and if you're working to integrate different platforms onto Branching Minds, like everyone has different cut scores, things are changing, and there's also the growth score. So it's like we have a lot of moving targets and a lot of different systems that track students differently. So So I guess just be mindful of that, and even creating like a little, like I'm thinking like a baby protocol at the beginning of every data conversation. That could be 45 seconds. Just like, what are we looking at here? Let's just make sure we can all name what's on this page before we even move forward. I think that's a challenge, but a good strategy to overcome it.
I think that provides really easy access points too, and kind of decreases the temperature in the room. If you throw up that visual, almost think about it as like a secondary lesson, like the do now. Like the visual's up there and everyone's just hanging out, milling around your PD room. And you're like, before we even get started, what are we looking at? What do you see here? And they're going to say scatter plot, colors, red, green. And you just kind of take it down a notch. Because I think if we lead into the next question, everyone that you're talking to, whether it's a teacher, an administrator, folks above you at central office, students themselves, parents, they all got other things going on. So how do we balance the need to get this data? And oftentimes it's behavioral data with all the other demands that are on us. And Mike, I know in your work, you do some of this. Can you speak to this? How do you balance it? What do you do?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big challenge. I spend a lot of time trying to determine, what is the actual outcome that we're trying to reach, right? So do data measures already exist? I might sit on a child study team or an IEP meeting. Are we looking at behaviors that are interfering with grades? Well, if we already we're already tracking grades, we don't need to do additional data tracking. We can kind of use that as a proxy. But what if not? What if we're looking to track specific, challenging behaviors and or pro-social behaviors? So what I'm really looking to do is collect as much data with the least amount of effort possible. So one of the tools that I really like to use are called behavior rating scales. I think I have an example on slide 24. And so what I'm trying to, so basically the idea with this, I think it's the next one. Yep, there we go. So basically the idea with this type of data, so this is just examples of different dimensions of data. It's called an anchored data rating system. So typically your 4 on this scale is your baseline. I'm often going to be collecting baseline via some sort of measure, whether it's duration or whether it's frequency. And I make that my baseline a number 4. 1, 2, and 3 are kind of different variations or degrees of progress. So we can kind of track to see how is the student making progress and at what rate. And a 5 is basically, are they doing worse? Typically, I'm not too concerned with what is the rate of worsening of the behavior. It's just the fact that it's getting worse is concerning. Secondarily, what I like to do is kind of track, what interventions are we implementing and when? And what we can then do is kind of put these two things together. I can track, good enough data, which is what I like often. So I'll use the behavior rating scale. I'm not getting actual numbers of the number of times this child may have done something. I'm kind of getting like an approximate amount, but that's usually good enough for our purposes. And then I can kind of track that along with, what interventions are we implementing? When did we implement them? And then as time goes on, see, has the behavior data changed as a result? I like this because I can graph this, but this also kind of creates a graph in and of itself. If you circle each number and you can kind of draw a line through its progress, as the line goes down, you can see that it's improving. As the line goes up, you can see that it's worsening. You can also track it via, periods of the day or blocks in the day. Overwhelmingly, staff tell me this is easy enough data for me to report on. And so I've had teachers that are the only staff in classrooms use this data every 40 minute block. They're able to collect some data on the targeted behavior that we're trying to either increase or decrease. And it's not them sitting there with a clicker clicking every time the behavior happened. It is an estimate. But if I'm sitting in the classroom doing like a fidelity check, more often than not, my numbers correspond to what they're reporting. And the second thing is when I go to a meeting and we're making changes or we're talking about recommendations or changes in the child's program, much more often than not, the teacher's report corresponds very well to the data that they've given me. When I use other measures like duration or like frequency only, that's not always the case. And so I find that this is it's very user friendly and it's very accurate, which is really what I'm looking for when I'm trying to collect behavioral data.
Mike, we thank you for that. And that focus on accuracy is so important with ease, right? You can just tell wherever it is in the frequency, if it's 1 through 5, and how you can then quickly turn that into a line plot is fantastic. Another situation, if we move to the next question, is kind of what you would use that for. So that's you taking that data. You're the one reporting it. Maybe you're advocating for the child or advocating for more support. So you know what you're seeing. I wonder what happens sometimes, and folks might not even admit this, but when we get the data as maybe supervisors or coordinators or principals, and then you're being told, hey, but in the room, that's not what it looks like, or that's not how it is. So how do we respond when our data doesn't match what the staff in the classroom is reporting? Dr. Rapplier, can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that is circling around this conversation is the relationship that we have with people as we're having these data conversations. And it is not infrequent that we are struggling to solve problems for students. And in those sort of tense moments in these relationships, from time to time, professionals differ in what they're seeing. And I think having a relationship with folks that's based on good intellectual conversations about the information is a good starting point. Do we have, with the staff that we're working with, if I come in as a consultant cold to a teacher that I've never met before and I tell her, I disagree, here's your data's wrong, my data's right, the likelihood that will be a winning conversation and that the teacher will walk away with a changed vision for what's happening is very unlikely. Instead, what we need to do is have an understanding of what information they are reporting it and how they're gathering it. Join sort of shoulder to shoulder with them and look at how they're collecting data. Michael talked to, give us a really good vision for how this data collection tool can turn very easily into a graphical representation. What we need to do is create a partnership in looking at data. Now, in asking questions about those data, probing it, and then in sharing with them the methods for your collection of data or the methods for review of data is the only way you can kind of move forward with the staff and change the way they look at the data. The other thing that we need to use is a technique called a third point conversation. So it's not your data and my data, it's data. It's not you or me, it's not me versus you, it's a third point. And that third point, you begin by having a third point conversation about other things, and then the data sets that you're reviewing are inanimate objects that you get to kind of shoulder by shoulder perceive with each other, asking questions, answering questions, and creating conversations that are low inference about the data are another way in which you can further an understanding. Now, in the end, sometimes people don't see eye to eye on a topic, and that's okay. If you've created a factual anchor that allows you to move forward, you're much, much more likely to get as close as you can.
So I wonder from the folks around us, not a poll, but just in the chat, we talk about trust with Mike and Steve right there. How literate and trusting is your staff in data? Just as Steve said, a consultant could show up and say, hey, here it is, and they can have that honest conversation. So just take a moment in the chat and tell us, use that umbrella. Are you getting rained on? Meaning like they don't trust you. They're not going to be able to have that conversation without a lot of support. Are you partially covered, or is your system waterproof? Are you getting protected?
There's an interesting response in the chat about that. The disconnect often with with the parent's view of behavior from home. And one of the interesting conversations that I think is worth having around that is it's not the same behavior because it's not the same environment. And having conversations about what the demands of a school environment are and what you observe there versus what the demands of a home environment and what you observe there can be a really fruitful conversation. The same sort of conversation you can have with staff, multiple staff who work with students, but may see the students very differently. There are relationships and there are environments that are very, very different, so that a behavior or an outcome is very much affected by those contexts. And having conversations about those contexts and illustrating those contexts in our data is hugely important. That's why, we have a few school psychologists in these screens that you're seeing before you. The idea of collecting data from parents and from school for things like adaptive scales and for attention deficit disorder scales and for psychiatric scales is an important part of the collection of data and reporting of data, because students behave differently in different contexts. And that's very important to get a full picture. Understanding that you have a part of the picture is really how you bring a parent around to understanding the data that you're presenting.
I'll say too, I think if I can add, I worked in a district a while back, and everything on their state tests was pretty much less. It was like in a gap analysis, it was less than the surrounding area. It was underperforming for the state. And when we went in on it, the whole thing is red. It's all negative numbers. It's not great. So I removed the red, right? So it was like a neutral color. And then we went to look for like as close to zero or like a +1, +1 in the gap analysis as we could get. And so we hunted for our assets, even if they were so limited. That was the lens that we went in on, because I say to people, I want, whether it's a whole faculty, a whole school, a whole department, or like 2 teachers, I want you to leave feeling like an industrious little busy bee. I do not want you to leave chatting with me feeling like you're wearing the weight of the world on your shoulders. So you have to leave with like some action, feel good about it. And if you're, as the person who's offering the data set, and I think that's who's mostly in our chat and in the session, like what you're presenting, if it's kind of not the best story, it's like, well, we're in it. So let's figure out and we're going to work to make it better. So let's take that lens. And so even approaching it and being like, yeah, let's find and yes, the glows and where we're growing to might be really minimal, but that's the work that we're doing. That's what we're focusing on. We're not looking at our largest deficit and trying to remedy it, because that's not even possible. What is possible is making gains in where we're already strong. So really focusing from an asset kind of lens, but also doing that with the visual. So it's like you arrive set with it, and then the conversation that follows.
Thank you, Steve and Victoria, for that. As we progress this conversation, that we've talked about how we build trust, how you even use these visualizations to start the conversation. We've talked about some areas on what we can use it for, but our whole chat's filled with people saying, hey, do you have ideas for using it with this idea, this topic, this situation? Sometimes it boils down to this question in front of us: what ways can data visualization help identify and then find a way to address the difference in how the student's performing right now and the actual things that we need to put in place to support them? Anyone from our panel? Or anyone out there? If you're showing that data and then speaking to how the student performs, sometimes it'll highlight what we're not doing right as educators, as building administrators, as system designers. I think when we hold data meetings at grade levels and we're looking at our tier 2 students, our tier 3 students, and you're seeing these students pop up when you're isolating topics like inferencing, and you're seeing it being reported as, we have a larger chunk of students not scoring well in this area, and they're being pulled for AIS or RTI or whatever your district calls it. It might be time to turn that window into a mirror and say, wow, if we're pulling the most kids for this particular thing that we're testing for, that's a tier 1 problem. Maybe that's about how we're teaching inferency that's not working. It's something as simple as that attendance. If our problem is seat time, well, obviously our PBIS system or what we're doing to create engagement isn't working. In the chat here, sometimes it says when we're looking at data for a student, it becomes apparent that the student's peer group is as low or lower. So exactly, Francine, that's what I'm talking about. The real other side of the RTI MTSS coin is tier 2 and tier 3 show the holes in tier 1. You wouldn't need a hitting coach if you were hitting at the top of the league, if you put it in a sports metaphor. You wouldn't need all these students pulled for this math unit if we were doing a good job teaching that. And that's right, as Christine points out, it's not an easy conversation. The first part is getting folks to talk about the areas where they need support. And only then, once you've run a full cycle and given folks support and make them trust your system of doing this work, can you say, hey, for the past 3 years, we've really had to support students when they learn about X and Y. Wait, how do we teach X and Y the first time around? Is it time to look at that? So if anybody else from the team wants to jump in here, feel free. We're moving along. We can also jump to the next question. So
yeah, I would say even class to class, that can be a real great tool. Like, for instance, if the data across one class reflects a challenge in a particular area or a particular skill set, if you're fortunate enough to work in a school where a teacher might get the opportunity to, hey, why don't you take a look to see what they're doing in there for that? It can be a very proactive, positive way to look at, I didn't notice I was doing that differently. Or, they seem to put a lot of value in this part of the lesson or in this particular behavior. And you can glean some good ideas. And the data can be your guide for whose strategies, whose interventions tend to be working the best.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's a moment where the visualization is actually the jumping point to the work. It's not the ending point. And I want to just touch on the idea of like a dashboard compared to a visualization. So dashboards certainly got like clapped at in street data, which I'm sure most of you have read. I'll pop the book in the chat in a second if you haven't. And the idea is that like some dashboards and some visualizations, they have a lot of implicit bias in them, and they are biased. And so if you're then searching for that, for their bias, you're going to probably find it, and you don't want a visualization to make like a situation that's there appear like something it's not, or be a misrepresentation of what's going on in your building or your district. So once you have it and you see there's a disparity, I think jumping into like what Dan's saying, like that, like interclassroom visitation and the work with colleagues, that's really what we're after. We're not so much after, paralysis by analysis. We're not into that. We're into like the real work. And you can have the best visuals in the world. You can have the most beautiful dashboards. You can have a brand deck. You can have all the hex codes. But at the end of the day, if that's not improving the quality of the school for the teachers or for the students, it's like, well, what are we doing? So I think like using what we have as a jump off for the other work that we know is excellent to be doing in our schools is the point. So thanks, Dan, for bringing that up.
I think thank you, Victoria and Dan, for kind of bridging to some of the closing points of our conversation when all these practices, all these ideas become practice. So when we look at the role of using data literacy and data visualization, how can we do that to enhance their understanding of the data? So I think Kelly White, in your role as assistant superintendent, can you speak to us about this?
Yes, and sorry, I was caught off earlier before because I thought this question was earlier, and I'm a planner, so I got called on for something I wasn't prepared to speak to at that time, so I apologize. But this is, what I was prepared to speak to. So in terms of, I broke this into two parts. In terms of the role that data literacy plays, I tried to put this into different buckets. Supporting first supports for data interpretation. So we again, like we're very lucky here to have we work with Victoria from BOCES here on a regular basis, and as I said earlier, not all of our educators have been trained on analyzing data. So having structures and processes for how we review data has been really helpful. So even just basic protocols like a notice and wonder or a SWOT analysis has been really helpful for us. And again, a lot of those protocols aren't introduced to teachers when they're planning to become educators. So taking the time to provide support for teachers on how to analyze data has been really helpful. And then that being said, we are able to, once we have protocols for looking at data, we, it's easier for teachers to make decisions related to that data. So the data visualizations just provide more valuable insights, and I think our educators feel more confident when they're looking at a visualization rather than just a big pool of data, which in turn then allows them to communicate a lot clearer about what the needs of our students are, and also then communicating them to our stakeholders, such as our board and our parents. And related to that is, again, better progress monitoring. So again, since we don't want to have to keep looking at big spreadsheets of data and trying to analyze that, having these data literacy skills leads to better progress monitoring, which creates that culture of continuous improvement for our teacher. So all these things relates to just teacher empowerment, and we really, here in Ellenville, we're working on improving our teachers' data literacy skills so they do feel empowered. So when we do make that shift from RTI to MTSS, they feel more confident that they have the skills to look at a visualizations, make decisions, communicate them clearer, be able to make better decisions for their students, and just continue that cycle of improvement. The second part of the question was related to how educators and staff can increase their data literacy. I think that's on slide 15, if you want to go down. So some of our ideas around this is, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that regular hands-on practice with structured frameworks. So when you're introducing teachers to data analysis, is giving them frameworks to look at data and make decisions with it. Something that we've found in Ellenville to be really valued by our staff is providing as much collaborative team planning time that we can. Everyone across our grade levels and departments have different levels of expertise when it comes to data analysis and data visualizations. And our teachers here find that better than bringing any outside presenter in is just giving them time with colleagues to really dive in and understand and improve their data literacy skills side by side. In terms of the next component there, tools, we to enhance our staff's literacy, we don't feel like we need to go out and purchase any fancy tools. Like, we're excited to partner with Branching Minds, which does offer data visualization. But with some of the programs we use, like we use IXL here, the visuals in there are really great. And we want to make sure that we're encouraging teachers to get onto their individual dashboards and see what those what can be offered through just programs that we have here in district, rather than saying that they have to go elsewhere to take their data elsewhere to visualize it a certain way. Lastly, including students, or two more things, including students in the process. We find that when teachers are, as they get more comfortable with their data literacy skills, introducing students how to track and monitor their own progress. So one thing one of our teachers in our junior high does is they have students log into their IXL account and look at their data and set goals for themselves based on that data. And I feel like having the students do that encourages the teachers to keep going to increase their skill set. And lastly, we've been doing a lot of work in our district with updating our curriculum maps. And our first year of that work focused on creating year at a glance and a curriculum map to go along with that. And year two of that work has been, okay, we have our maps designed. Now let's start taking a look at our data and making sure that we're using our data to make sure that our tier one instruction doesn't need to be, or may or may not need to be adjusted based on what our data is revealing to us.
Kelly, thank you for really discussing a practical use of this, especially at your level, and what that looks like from your lens, because you not only have to work above and speak to the board and the superintendent, but then you have to speak with your instructional leaders, your teachers, and then even families. So wonderful job in discussing that. This conversation could take half a day. I can't believe we're done with our time here. So what I'm going to throw in the chat is this. I think Victoria did that herself, but through the chat conversation, we've seen a lot of people throw up some wonderful topics. Even more people say, hey, what about this? What about that? Can I get help here or there? So feel free to just reach out. There's a lot of folks here who help districts and help staff all across New York, New England, and the whole nation. So reach out. We'll put some information there. Feel free just to say hello and say, hey, here's my question. And I want to thank everybody on our panel. And thank Christina for hosting us. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I was frantically taking notes on my own Post-it while trying to also change the slides. So
thank you for a great conversation
today. As we are wrapping up, you do have access to these slides and this recording. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see that replay option. That is where, once the videos have been trimmed down, so it doesn't include us at the beginning, just kind of chatting, you can always go back and replay our conversation. I also would definitely be taking these questions and bringing them to my own staff meetings. How are we having these same kind of authentic conversations about data? This is an amazing gift that these presenters have given us to be able to take these same reflective questions back to our building. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our presenters. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your summit today, and we'll see you.